What if a single sentence spoken in anger was enough to fracture Windsor Castle's walls of silence? This is the moment Camilla crossed the line, insulting Queen Elizabeth's memory and igniting Princess Anne's wrath. It began innocently enough, as so many royal gatherings often do. Inside Windsor's private chambers, the air was thick with polite conversation, glasses clinking, and carefully rehearsed smiles. But beneath the polished surface lingered the tensions of a family still reeling from the loss of its matriarch. Queen Elizabeth's absence was a shadow that hung over every room, every corridor, every whispered exchange. For Anne, her mother's memory wasn't just sacred, it was untouchable. And yet, in that fragile silence, Camilla allowed words to slip from her mouth that cut like a blade. They weren't shouted at, nor were they delivered with venom. But the carelessness and the dismissive tone was enough to draw every eye toward her. She remarked, almost flippantly, that perhaps the Queen's traditions had kept the monarchy stuck in the past for far too long. In any other setting, it might have been brushed aside. But in Windsor, with Elizabeth's spirit still lingering, in every portrait, every relic, every stone of the castle walls, those words were heresy. The room froze. Courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, their silence louder than any rebuke. A gasp from one aide seemed to echo, swallowed quickly by the hush that followed. The insult to the Queen's memory was not just spoken, it was etched into the ears of everyone who stood in that room. And then came the stare. Princess Anne's gaze locked on Camilla, sharp and unyielding, the kind of look that could silence armies. It wasn't rage that burned in Anne's eyes, it was something colder, deeper. It was the unspoken warning of a daughter who would defend her mother's legacy at all costs. Camilla shifted uncomfortably, trying to brush it off with a laugh, but the sound faltered. The moment had already spread like wildfire. Whispers began weaving through Windsor's corridors, moving from one servant to another, from advisors to aides. Did you hear what she said about the Queen? How could she speak so lightly of Her Majesty's reign? The castle, once a bastion of secrecy, had become a drum echoing with betrayal. To the public, Windsor was still calm, dignified, a fortress untouched. But within those walls, Anne's silent fury carried more weight than any crown or title. She had lived her entire life in the Queen's shadow, shouldering burdens without complaint, fighting battles most would never see. For her, this wasn't just a careless remark. It was a desecration. And so, the seeds of rebellion were planted, not with a scandal splashed across headlines, but with a single sentence whispered into the wrong air. Anne's jaw tightened, her silence more terrifying than an outburst. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her intent clear. Camilla had crossed a line from which there was no return. The courtiers who witnessed it would later say they felt the air grow heavier, as if Windsor itself knew a storm had begun to brew. Camilla may have thought her words were forgotten as the evening carried on, but they had already carved fault lines into the very heart of the monarchy. But Anne's fury wasn't a passing storm. It was the spark of a reckoning that would drive Camilla out of Windsor forever. If Queen Elizabeth was the crown, then Princess Anne was its unyielding shield. Anne wasn't just her daughter, she was her fiercest protector, sworn to defend her mother's memory even against the Queen Consort herself. From childhood, Anne had carried the weight of responsibility not with resentment, but with a relentless determination that set her apart. Where others faltered under the burden of royal expectations, Anne thrived. She was the one who never bent, never yielded, and never allowed sentiment to weaken her resolve. To her, the monarchy wasn't an institution. It was her inheritance, carved into her very soul by the woman who had ruled with dignity for more than 70 years. For decades, Anne had been called the Steel of the royal family, a title that spoke less of affection and more of resilience. While her brothers were swept up in personal struggles and scandals, she held the line. While others chased comfort or influence, she embraced duty with a sharp-edged loyalty that could cut through any doubt. This was why Elizabeth leaned on her, confided in her, and trusted her to safeguard not just the throne, but the family itself. And in the wake of the Queen's passing, Anne had vowed privately that her mother's memory would never be tainted. never reduced to an afterthought, and never mocked, not by anyone. That promise had only grown heavier since Camilla had stepped into a role many considered unthinkable. To Anne, Camilla was not the embodiment of stability, but the symbol of intrusion, an outsider woven into the monarchy's heart after decades of controversy. Every time Camilla's influence seeped further into royal life, Anne felt her mother's memory pushed a step further into the shadows. The thought was intolerable. It was not jealousy, nor petty rivalry. It was the righteous anger of a daughter who believed that her mother's sacrifices had laid the very foundation upon which the crown still stood. The clash between Anne's unyielding devotion and Camilla's ambition had been simmering since the Queen's funeral. Camilla, now elevated as Queen Consort, sought to leave her mark, to reshape traditions in ways Anne found dangerous, even disrespectful. Anne's voice was sharp in private council meetings, her words cutting as she reminded Charles and his advisors of the promises they had made, to honor Elizabeth, to preserve her legacy, to never let her reign be overshadowed. She warned her brother again and again that allowing Camilla to take liberties with their mother's memory would poison public trust and fracture the monarchy from within. Charles, torn between love for his wife and loyalty to his mother's memory, often wavered, and in that hesitation, Anne's distrust deepened. To her, the stakes were simple. Either Elizabeth's legacy remained untarnished, or it was lost forever. And so, when Camilla's careless remark about the Queen's reign holding the monarchy in the past reached Anne's ears, it was not merely offensive. It was betrayal. It was confirmation of everything she had feared. It was the one sin Anne could not forgive. For Anne, this wasn't just a family quarrel. It was a battle for the soul of the monarchy itself. Every ounce of loyalty she had given, every scar she bore from years of duty, pointed her to one conclusion. If Camilla sought to diminish the Queen's memory, then Camilla had no place in Windsor, no place in the sacred spaces Elizabeth had built. And so, Anne prepared to confront Camilla not just as a sister-in-law, but as a soldier defending the monarchy's soul. Behind Windsor's gilded doors, voices rose, footsteps echoed, and history trembled. Princess Anne had cornered Camilla, and the confrontation would leave the monarchy shaken. The air inside those halls seemed to shift, heavy with a tension that no one dared disturb. Anne moved with purpose, her footsteps quick and resolute, her jaw set as though carved from stone. She had reached her breaking point. The insult to her mother's memory was not going unanswered, not while she drew breath. When Anne found Camilla, there was no courtesy, no hesitation. Her voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the corridor. "Say it again," she demanded, her tone low but lethal. Camilla froze, caught off guard, but quickly attempted to brush it aside. With a half-hearted chuckle, she waved her hand as though the remark had been nothing more than an innocent jest. But Anne's glare told her otherwise. There would be no laughter here. Not today. Not ever. Anne pressed on, her words fierce and unrelenting. She reminded Camilla of the Queen's sacrifices, of the decades Elizabeth had spent carrying the monarchy on her shoulders while others faltered. Anne spoke of duty, of endurance, of a reign that demanded respect beyond question. "You dare diminish her name," she hissed. Each syllable weighted with the fury of a daughter defending her mother's honor. The words reverberated through the corridor, powerful enough to make even the walls seem to lean closer. By then, staff had gathered quietly along the edges of the hall, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They stood as silent witnesses to a battle no one had imagined would play out in full view. Every breath was measured, every movement cautious, as though one wrong sound might ignite the flames further. Tension curled around them like smoke, suffocating yet impossible to escape. This was no ordinary quarrel. It was the monarchy's deepest fault lines splitting open before their eyes. Camilla, her pride wounded, fired back with words she should have swallowed. With a defiant sneer, she dismissed Anne's fury as nothing more than obsession. "You're living in the past," she said coldly, "clinging to ghosts that no longer matter." That phrase, the dismissal of Queen Elizabeth's memory as irrelevant, was a strike that landed harder than any physical blow. Gasps rippled among the staff. Some lowered their eyes. Others exchanged horrified glances. Anne stepped forward, her face pale, but her voice like thunder. There was no wavering, no hesitation, only the cold certainty of a woman who knew her authority extended beyond titles. "Then hear me now," she declared, her tone cutting through the silence like steel. "Leave Windsor." The words echoed, final and immovable, leaving no space for argument. It was not a request. It was a command that carried with it the weight of tradition, loyalty, and an unbreakable promise to her mother's legacy. Camilla faltered. For the first time, she realized Anne's fury was not the fleeting temper of a grieving daughter, but the battle cry of a warrior defending the monarchy itself. The staff remained frozen, knowing they had witnessed a turning point, a moment that would not fade but would instead linger, reshaping the balance of power inside the palace walls. But what seemed like a clash of tempers was only the beginning. Anne was prepared to enforce her command with royal authority. King Charles stood at the crossroads of blood and love, torn between his wife's defense and his sister's unyielding demand. News of the confrontation between Anne and Camilla reached him swiftly, carried through the whispers of shaken staff who had witnessed the exchange. Their words painted a picture of tension so sharp it could cut through the marble halls of Windsor. For Charles, it was more than a family argument. It was a crisis that placed his mother's memory, his sister's loyalty, and his wife's dignity in a collision course that only he could try to navigate. In the privacy of his chambers, he summoned Anne, hoping to calm the storm before it consumed them all. His voice was softer than usual, almost pleading, as he asked her to reconsider. He reminded her that Camilla, despite her words, was still queen consort, and that publicly humiliating her would fracture the monarchy in ways that might never heal. But Anne was not swayed. Her reply was sharp and unrelenting, echoing with the conviction of someone who had already made peace with the consequences. "Protecting her means betraying Mother," she declared, her words slicing through the air with a finality Charles could not ignore. Those words carried the weight of memory. The Queen was gone, but her presence was everywhere in Charles's heart, in Anne's voice, in the very stones of Windsor that seemed to echo with her legacy. He remembered his mother's steady hand, her unwavering devotion, her sacrifices that had kept the monarchy alive through decades of storms. To allow her memory to be insulted, even unintentionally, felt like a betrayal Charles could scarcely bear. And yet, Camilla was his wife, the woman who had stood by his side through scandal, ridicule, and decades of waiting in the shadows. His heart was bound to her, even as his crown bound him to the legacy of his mother. Camilla, on the other hand, was unrepentant. She insisted that Charles take control, that he silence Anne before her words and actions undermined the dignity of the queen consort. To Camilla, this was no longer a family quarrel. It was a matter of her own survival within the palace. Her fury grew sharper each time she recalled Anne's command to leave Windsor. In her mind, Charles had no choice but to stand firmly with her, to prove that his marriage could withstand the challenges of loyalty to his sister. But Charles was paralyzed, caught between the two most powerful women in his life. To side with Anne was to risk alienating Camilla, the partner who had endured so much to finally stand at his side. To defend Camilla was to betray his sister, and, worse still, his mother's memory. It was a decision that twisted his heart, leaving him restless and uncertain. Every path forward seemed poisoned, every choice lined with guilt. He could feel the monarchy's fragile unity slipping like sand between his fingers, and he had no strength to hold it still. And yet, Windsor was not Charles's decision to make it Anne's battlefield, and she would not surrender. In Windsor's history, exile was rare, but Anne's decree carried the force of centuries. Camilla was no longer welcome inside the Queen's home. The castle that had stood as the heart of Elizabeth's reign, the fortress where her legacy lived in every room, would not be tainted by a presence Anne deemed unworthy. It was not anger that drove her now, but duty, the kind of cold, unwavering sense of responsibility that defined her every action. Anne understood that Windsor was not just another royal residence. It was the living sanctuary of her mother's spirit, and no insult to Elizabeth could ever be permitted to linger within its walls. The decision was not made in haste, nor spoken in the heat of confrontation. Instead, Anne summoned the senior staff and officials who governed Windsor's day-to-day operations. She gathered them in a chamber that had once echoed with her mother's counsel, and with measured words, she made her declaration: Camilla, Queen Consort, is banned from Windsor Castle. The silence that followed was deafening. Advisors exchanged bewildered glances, their disbelief painted across their faces. How could a princess, even one as formidable as Anne, overrule the Queen Consort? Was it rebellion? Or was it loyalty, elevated above protocol? The weight of tradition was Anne's shield. Windsor was more than a royal residence. It was Elizabeth's chosen sanctuary, her retreat from the glare of the crown, her eternal home in both life and death. By invoking that history, Anne placed her decree beyond mere family squabbles. This was not a sister silencing a rival. It was a daughter guarding the sacred grounds of her mother's memory. Those present felt the gravity in her tone, the sense that centuries of royal authority stood behind her words, giving them the power of law even if no document bore her seal. For the advisors, it was a moment of reckoning. Some shifted uncomfortably, their loyalties torn between constitutional roles and the unspoken hierarchy of respect. Others lowered their heads, as though silently agreeing that Anne had spoken the truth that no one else dared to voice. In that instant, Windsor itself seemed to belong not to Charles, not to Camilla, but to Elizabeth, and by extension, to Anne, her protector. When the news was relayed to Camilla, the reaction was one of disbelief. To be told, not by her husband, not by Parliament, but by Anne, that she was barred from Windsor, struck like a blow to her dignity. Her fury was matched only by her humiliation. She demanded to know by what right Anne could dictate her movements, yet even she knew that Windsor was not just stone and mortar. It was Elizabeth's legacy, and that gave Anne all the authority she needed. Camilla's protests fell flat, swallowed by the knowledge that the Queen's memory carried more power in Windsor than the Queen Consort's crown ever could. It was a banishment dressed in ceremony, delivered with icy precision, and stamped with the seal of reverence for Elizabeth. For Camilla, it was a scar that could not be erased, a humiliation that would echo far beyond the castle gates. For Anne, it was not cruelty, it was justice. And for Windsor, it was a return to purity, a reminder that its walls would not bend to ambition or compromise. But exile is never quiet in the aftermath. Whispers grew into a storm that threatened to shake the monarchy's future. With Camilla cast out, Windsor's halls split into factions, those who whispered in sympathy for the Queen Consort, and those who stood fiercely behind Anne. The atmosphere was no longer one of seamless royal order, but of quiet fractures running through every corridor, every chamber, every exchange of glances among staff. What had once been a fortress of unity now carried the unmistakable air of division, the kind that could not be hidden even behind gilded walls. Every servant, every advisor, every official now carried a choice in their silence. Would they stand with Anne, or would they risk aligning with Camilla? The old guard, those who had served Elizabeth faithfully for decades, wasted no time in declaring their loyalty. For them, Anne's decree was not a rebellion, but a restoration of order. These were men and women who still spoke of the Queen in reverent tones, who believed Windsor belonged not to the current throne, but to the eternal memory of Elizabeth. To see Anne take such decisive action filled them with a sense of vindication. She had spoken aloud what many of them had felt silently for years, that Camilla's presence was an intrusion into sacred ground. For these veterans of Windsor's long service, Anne's word was law, and their allegiance was immovable. But the younger courtiers saw the matter differently. They, raised in a new age of transparency and diplomacy, were uneasy at the sight of such division. Many of them admired Anne, but they also recognized Camilla's growing role as Queen Consort and the potential fallout from outright exclusion. To them, Anne's command seemed harsh, even dangerous. They feared the optics, the leaks, the inevitable headlines that would emerge if the truth escaped Windsor's walls. Their hesitance added layers of tension as loyalties fractured along generational lines, creating not just a rift within the staff, but a mirror of the monarchy's own internal struggle between tradition and adaptation. And inevitably, the whispers began to drift outward. The press caught the faintest hints of discord, enigmatic reports of tensions at Windsor, careful suggestions that not all was well within the royal household. No one dared to publish the full truth, Not yet, but the shadows of rumor crept across the front pages, feeding a public already suspicious of palace unity. The story was fragile, cloaked in secrecy, yet it carried the power to unravel reputations if ever exposed. Behind the scenes, William and Catherine observed in silence. They did not speak publicly, nor did they intervene openly, but their quiet alignment was unmistakable. By their presence beside Anne during private moments, by the steady reassurance they offered in family discussions, they made their loyalties known. To them, Anne was not just defending Elizabeth's memory, she was protecting the very dignity of the monarchy itself. Their silent support gave Anne strength, but it also deepened the fracture. For if the future king and queen aligned with her, then Camilla stood even more isolated. The unity of the monarchy, once its greatest strength, was visibly strained. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into debates, and debates into firm divides. Windsor was no longer a single, unbroken household. It was a battleground of loyalty and resentment, with every corridor echoing the question of who truly belonged and who did not. But the most explosive fallout wasn't among staff. It was in the private chambers of Camilla herself. Banished from Windsor, Camilla's fury burned hotter than ever. To her, it was more than an insult. It was humiliation on a global stage. Windsor had not only been a residence, it had symbolized acceptance, a place where she believed her role as queen consort had finally taken root. To be cast out by Anne, dismissed as if she were nothing more than an interloper, was a wound too deep to disguise. Behind closed doors, her composure fractured, and the rage she tried to conceal from the public erupted in private, with a force that shook those closest to her. To her inner circle, Camilla vented without restraint. She spoke of betrayal, of being treated like an intruder in a home where she had struggled for decades to be acknowledged. Every word carried bitterness, sharpened by the sting of rejection. She insisted that her marriage to Charles had earned her the right to stand within those walls, that her crown itself should have been enough to protect her from humiliation. Yet Anne's decree had stripped all that away in a single stroke, leaving her exposed and humiliated in ways she had never imagined possible. Her anger did not stop at Anne. Charles himself became a target of her resentment. She could not understand how he had allowed his sister's voice to drown out his own authority as king. To Camilla, Charles's silence was worse than Anne's fury. It was abandonment. She reminded him, again and again, of the sacrifices she had made to remain at his side through scandal and ridicule, of the years she had endured as the shadowed figure behind the throne. Now, at the very moment she had secured her place, he had stood idle while his sister stripped her of dignity. The bitterness of that realization only deepened her fury. In the quiet of those moments, memories resurfaced. Camilla recalled the ETV's long struggle to be accepted, the endless battle to move from reviled outsider to crowned consort. She had borne public scorn, endured whispers that she would never truly belong, and yet she had persisted. Each step of that journey had been marked by resilience. Now, to be thrown back into the role of an unwanted intruder felt like the cruelest twist of fate. It was as if all the sacrifices she had made had been erased in an instant, her triumph reduced to ashes by Anne's cold decree. But Camilla's anger was not just wounded pride, it was a vow. She swore, with venom in her voice, that she would never forgive Anne for this humiliation. She would not let the insult stand unchallenged. To her, this was not the end of her influence, but the beginning of a counter-move that would reclaim her dignity. She began plotting in silence, calculating how to restore her power and strike back in a way that would remind both Anne and the monarchy that she was not so easily erased. Yet even as Camilla seethed and schemed, Anne was already preparing her final act, a public reminder of who truly guarded the Queen's memory. On the anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's passing, Anne stood before the nation not only to honor her mother, but to show the world that Windsor belonged to the Queen's true heirs. The service inside Windsor Chapel carried an air of reverence so profound that even the walls seemed to breathe in unison with those gathered. It was not merely a commemoration, it was a declaration. Every hymn, every word spoken, carried the weight of Elizabeth's reign and the enduring bond of loyalty that had outlived her presence. Anne, standing resolute at the center, became the living embodiment of that bond. The absence of Camilla was as telling as any speech. The seat where she might have sat remained deliberately empty, a silent reminder of the banishment that had shaken the monarchy. Yet, rather than diminish the ceremony, her absence amplified its meaning. It was Anne who led the solemn rites, Anne, whose voice carried through the chapel with unflinching strength, and Anne who became the unchallenged guardian of the Queen's memory before the watching world. In that sacred setting, her authority was not questioned, it was confirmed. By Anne's side stood William and Catherine, their presence a striking testament to continuity. They did not need to utter words. Their alignment with Anne was plain in their quiet solidarity. And flanking them, the younger royals, the children of William and Catherine, formed a tableau of the monarchy's future. The image was powerful, almost defiant. The old guard and the new generation standing together, without Camilla, in a seamless line of succession that seemed to stretch from Elizabeth's past to the crown's future. As Anne rose to speak, the chapel stilled to a silence, so deep it seemed to suspend time. Her words were measured, spoken not in anger, but with reverence that cut deeper than condemnation ever could. "The Queen's spirit remains unbroken," she declared, her voice steady, almost haunting. It was a phrase chosen carefully, carrying layers of meaning. On the surface, it was a tribute to Elizabeth's enduring legacy. But beneath it, it was a reminder to the family, to the nation, and most of all to Camilla, that Windsor's foundation could not be shaken, nor its memory rewritten. The impact of her words was immediate. Some wept quietly in the pews, their grief reignited by Anne's piercing tribute. Others clasped their hands tightly, overwhelmed by the sense of unity that seemed to bind everyone present. Beyond the chapel, the public watching from afar felt the resonance just as strongly. At that moment, Camilla's absence was not a controversy, but a confirmation. The monarchy's heart had declared its loyalty, and it was not to her. The service ended, not with whispers of division, but with a surge of reverence for the Queen's memory, and the daughter who had defended it so fiercely. To many, it seemed as though Anne had sealed Camilla's exclusion, not with confrontation, but with grace. The nation saw a family standing strong without its queen consort, and the message was undeniable. Windsor's sanctity had been preserved, but even as Windsor celebrated its protector, the storm Anne had unleashed was far from over. Camilla may have been banished from Windsor, but one truth remained. The palace never forgets, and neither does the queen consort. In the aftermath, Anne stood taller than ever, her role as Windsor's guardian solidified in the eyes of both family and nation. Yet outside the castle walls, Camilla was far from defeated. She began quietly regrouping her influence, drawing allies closer, preparing for the day when she could reclaim her standing. Charles, caught between loyalty to his sister and devotion to his wife, seemed increasingly weakened by the rift, his silence betraying the toll it was taking on his reign. The public, watching carefully, sensed cracks in the royal facade, whispering of deeper divisions that could no longer be hidden. And through it all, Anne's name rose steadily, her authority eclipsing even the thrones. But if Anne had claimed victory, it was temporary, for Camilla's inevitable counterattack still loomed on the horizon. And so, Windsor closes one chapter, but the war for the Queen's memory has only just begun. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.